There's a laboratory that doesn't exist in any official record, a place where human beings were frozen alive to study frostbite, where pregnant women were vivisected without anesthesia, where children were deliberately infected with plague, anthrax, and diseases that had no names. And when the war ended, when justice should have arrived, the men responsible didn't hang, they didn't stand trial, they didn't even lose their jobs. Instead, they were paid, protected, given immunity in exchange for their data. This is the story of Unit 731, the story of how America bought silence with freedom, and how the most disturbing human experiments in modern history simply vanished from the pages of justice. The year is 1945. Japan has just surrendered. The world is still reeling from the horrors revealed at Nuremberg, where Nazi doctors who conducted grotesque experiments on concentration camp prisoners are being brought to justice. The world watches as these men are condemned, executed, remembered as monsters. But thousands of miles away, in the frozen plains of Manchuria, another group of doctors is quietly packing their bags, burning documents, destroying evidence, and the Americans, who have just arrived to occupy Japan, are helping them do it. To understand how this happened, we need to go back to the 1930s, when Imperial Japan was expanding across Asia with a hunger that seemed insatiable. Back to a time when a young military doctor named Shiro Ishii looked at the Treaty of Geneva, which banned biological warfare, and saw not a moral boundary, but an opportunity. If every nation agreed to ban these weapons, Ishii reasoned, it meant they feared them, and if they feared them, it meant they worked. Ishii was ambitious, brilliant, charismatic in the way that dangerous men often are. He came from a wealthy family, graduated at the top of his class from Kyoto Imperial University, and joined the Imperial Japanese Army as a military surgeon. He traveled to the West, studying bacteriology in the finest institutions, and returned to Japan with a singular obsession. Biological weapons could win wars. They could decimate enemy populations without wasting bullets, without risking soldiers, without the mess of conventional warfare. All you needed was the right disease, the right delivery system, and the willingness to test it, not on animals, on human beings. The Japanese military listened. They were intrigued. Japan was already at war with China, and the campaign was brutal, bloody, and expensive. Anything that could provide an edge was worth exploring. And so, in 1936, in the occupied region of Manchuria, far from the eyes of the international community, construction began on a facility unlike anything the world had ever seen. It would be called the Epidemic Prevention and Water Purification Department, a name so benign, so bureaucratic, that no one would ever suspect what happened inside. But those who worked there knew it by another name, Unit 731. Manchuria in the 1930s was a wasteland of occupation. The Japanese called it Manchukuo, a puppet state carved out of northern China, ruled by a powerless emperor and controlled entirely by the Japanese military. It was cold, isolated, perfect for secrecy. The local population lived under brutal oppression, and resistance was met with mass executions. Into this landscape of fear and control, Unit 731 was born. The complex was massive, over 150 buildings spread across 6 square kilometers. It had dormitories, laboratories, crematoria, prison cells, and even its own airport. From the outside, it looked like a research campus, perhaps a university or a hospital. But the walls were thick, the windows were barred, and the chimneys were always smoking. Inside, the facility was divided into sections, each dedicated to a different aspect of biological warfare research. There were laboratories for cultivating bacteria, rooms filled with incubators where anthrax, cholera, typhoid, and plague were grown in industrial quantities. There were dissection theaters, operating rooms without the pretense of healing, where human subjects were cut open while still alive to observe the progression of disease in real time. There were pressure chambers to simulate high-altitude exposure, freezing rooms to test the limits of human endurance in sub-zero temperatures, and there were cells, rows and rows of cells, holding what the staff called logs. Not people, not prisoners, logs. As if they were lumber to be processed, resources to be consumed. Shiro Ishii ran this empire with absolute authority. He was a lieutenant general now, a man of status and power, and he had convinced the highest levels of the Japanese military that his work was essential to the empire's survival. He recruited the best and brightest, doctors, microbiologists, chemists, men who had taken the Hippocratic Oath and then quietly set it aside. Some were true believers, convinced they were serving their nation. Others were careerists, drawn by the prestige and the promise of advancement. And some, perhaps, were simply curious. Curious about what would happen if you infected a human being with bubonic plague and then didn't treat them. Curious about how long someone could survive in freezing water. Curious about whether a person could be kept alive while their organs were removed, one by one. The subjects of these experiments came from everywhere. Chinese civilians accused of being spies or resistance fighters, Soviet prisoners captured during border skirmishes, Koreans, Mongolians, a few Europeans, men, women, children. Some were genuine prisoners of war, most were not. Many were simply people who had been in the wrong place at the wrong time, swept up in raids and transported to Unit 731 in windowless trains. They arrived confused, terrified, and they almost never left. Estimates vary, but historians believe at least 10,000 people died inside that facility. Some say the number is closer to 20,000. We'll never know for certain, because Shiro Ishii made sure the records were destroyed. Let's talk about what happened inside those walls. Not in abstract terms, not with euphemisms. Because the only way to understand the magnitude of what was done, and the magnitude of what was forgiven, is to confront the reality of it. They started with diseases. Plague was a favorite. Bubonic plague, pneumonic plague, strains cultivated to be as lethal as possible. Prisoners were injected with plague bacteria and then monitored as the infection ravaged their bodies. Doctors recorded fever progression, lymph node swelling, the onset of septic shock, the moment of death. They took samples, they photographed the bodies, they dissected the corpses while they were still warm to see how the disease had spread through the tissues. And then they did it again, and again. Refining their methods, testing different dosages, different strains, different delivery mechanisms. But injections were too slow, too individualized. Ishii wanted something that could be weaponized on a massive scale. So they developed plague bombs. Ceramic shells filled with plague-infected fleas designed to shatter on impact and release the fleas into civilian populations. They tested these bombs in Chinese villages. Entire communities were infected. Thousands died. The Japanese military observed, took notes, and moved on to the next village. Frostbite research was another priority. Japanese soldiers were suffering in the harsh winters of Manchuria and northern China, and the military wanted solutions. So prisoners were taken outside in the dead of winter, their arms or legs exposed to sub-zero temperatures for hours at a time. Once the limbs were frozen solid, researchers tested different thawing methods: hot water, warm water, gradual warming, rapid warming. They wanted to know which method preserved the most tissue, which caused the most pain, which led to gangrene. Some prisoners had their limbs frozen and thawed repeatedly, over days or weeks, until the flesh turned black and fell away from the bone. The researchers recorded everything: photographs, measurements, detailed notes on tissue necrosis and the progression of decay. Vivisection was routine, not autopsy, vivisection, the dissection of living human beings. Anesthesia was rarely used because the researchers believed it might alter the physiological responses they were trying to observe. Prisoners were strapped to tables, their bodies opened with surgical precision, their organs examined while their hearts still beat. Doctors removed stomachs, intestines, lungs, even hearts, to see how long the subjects could survive without them. Pregnant women were cut open so researchers could observe fetal development at different stages of infection. Children were vivisected to compare their organ structures to those of adults. There were pressure chamber experiments, where prisoners were locked in sealed rooms and the air pressure was gradually reduced to simulate high-altitude conditions. Researchers wanted to know at what point the human body began to fail. Eyes ruptured, lungs collapsed, blood vessels burst. Death was agonizing and inevitable, but the data was meticulously recorded. There were experiments with poison gas, mustard gas, phosgene, hydrogen cyanide. Prisoners were locked in chambers and exposed to various concentrations while doctors observed from behind glass. They documented respiratory failure, skin blistering, convulsions, and the final moments of asphyxiation. There were experiments with grenades and flamethrowers, where prisoners were tied to stakes at varying distances to determine the lethal radius of different weapons. There were blood transfusion experiments, where prisoners were drained of blood and given transfusions of animal blood or seawater to see if the human body could adapt. It couldn't. They died in agony. And there were the rape rooms. Female prisoners, including young girls, were systematically raped by guards and staff to infect them with syphilis and gonorrhea. The progression of venereal diseases was then studied in detail, often without treatment, until the victims died from infection or were vivisected to examine the internal damage. The cruelty wasn't incidental. It was systematic. It was industrialized. It was science stripped of every shred of humanity, reduced to pure data collection. And the men who did this, who spent their days cutting open living human beings and their nights writing up reports, didn't see themselves as monsters. They saw themselves as patriots, as researchers, as men doing difficult but necessary work for the glory of the empire. August 1945. The atomic bombs have fallen. Hirohito has announced Japan's surrender. The war is over. And in Manchuria, Shiro Ishii receives the order he's been dreading. Destroy everything. Leave no evidence. The Soviets are coming, and they cannot know what happened here. The staff of Unit 731 moves quickly. Documents are burned by the thousands. Prisoners still alive in their cells are executed, their bodies cremated or dumped into rivers. Equipment is smashed. Buildings are rigged with explosives. Ishii orders the release of plague-infected rats into the surrounding countryside, a final act of sabotage that will cause outbreaks for years to come. And then, in the chaos of Japan's collapse, the staff disperses. Some flee to Japan. Others disappear into the Chinese population. A few are captured by the Soviets and eventually stand trial in a quiet proceeding that the world largely ignores. But Ishii and his senior officers make it back to Japan. They go to ground, hiding in rural areas, changing their names, waiting to see what will happen. And what happens is this. The Americans arrive. The occupation of Japan is led by General Douglas MacArthur, and his mission is clear. Rebuild Japan as a stable, capitalist ally in Asia, prevent the spread of communism, establish American influence in the Pacific. He has the authority to prosecute war criminals, and he does. The Tokyo trials begin, and Japanese generals, politicians, and military leaders are brought to justice for atrocities across Asia. Millions have died under Japanese occupation, and the world demands accountability. But there's a problem. The Americans have heard rumors. Whispers about a biological warfare program in Manchuria, about human experiments on a scale that rivals or exceeds anything the Nazis did. And more importantly, they've heard that the data still exists, that the scientists who ran the program are still alive, and that this data, this horrifying, unethical, irreplaceable data, could be incredibly valuable. The American occupation authorities, working under MacArthur's command, begin a quiet investigation. They're not interested in justice. They're interested in information. The Cold War is beginning. The Soviet Union is a rising threat. Biological warfare, once a theoretical concern, is now a strategic priority. The Americans have their own biological weapons program, but it's rudimentary, limited by ethical constraints and a lack of human data. Animal testing can only tell you so much. To truly understand how these diseases affect human beings, you need human test subjects. And the Americans have never been willing to cross that line. But the Japanese have. And they've done it on a scale that's almost unimaginable. They've tested every major pathogen, every conceivable delivery system, every variable of infection and mortality. They've killed thousands of people in the process, but they've generated data that no other nation on Earth possesses. Data that could give the United States a decisive advantage in the coming conflict with the Soviet Union. And so, in 1946, the Americans make contact with Shiro Ishii. The negotiations are handled quietly, far from the Tokyo trials, far from the journalists and the international observers. Ishii is offered a deal: immunity from prosecution in exchange for full disclosure of his research. No trial, no punishment, no public acknowledgement of what he's done. Just the data. Everything. Every report, every photograph, every measurement, every observation. The Americans want it all, and they're willing to pay for it with silence. Ishii agrees. Of course he agrees. The alternative is a noose. The exchange begins. Over the following months, Ishii and his senior staff provide the Americans with over 10,000 pages of documentation, reports on plague cultivation and dissemination, detailed autopsy findings from vivisection experiments, data on frostbite treatment and pressure chamber fatalities, information on the effectiveness of biological weapons in field conditions. The Americans take it all. They study it, they classify it, and they bury it. But they need more than just Ishii. They need to ensure that the entire leadership of Unit 731 is protected, because if even one of them is prosecuted, the whole program becomes public. And so, one by one, the senior scientists are granted immunity. They're debriefed by American intelligence officers, handed clean records, and allowed to return to civilian life. Some go on to have distinguished careers. They become professors at prestigious universities. They open hospitals and clinics. They receive awards for their contributions to medicine. And no one ever asks them what they did during the war. The Soviets, meanwhile, are furious. They've captured a handful of lower-level Unit 731 staff during the occupation of Manchuria, and they've learned enough to understand the scale of the atrocities. In 1949, they hold a trial in Khabarovsk, where 12 Japanese soldiers and scientists are convicted of war crimes related to biological warfare. The testimony is damning. Witnesses describe the experiments in detail. The world hears, briefly, about Unit 731. But the Americans dismiss the trial as Soviet propaganda. They claim the confessions were coerced, the evidence fabricated. The story fades. And the real architects of the program, protected by American immunity, live out their lives in peace. Let's talk about what happened to these men. Because this isn't just about the experiments. It's about what came after. About how a society absorbs and forgets its own monstrosity. Shiro Ishii, the man who oversaw the torture and murder of at least 10,000 human beings, died in 1959 of throat cancer. He was 67 years old. He lived in Tokyo, in a comfortable house, and he was never prosecuted. He was never shamed. He converted to Christianity near the end of his life, and some of his friends claimed he expressed remorse. But he never made a public statement. He never apologized. And he took most of his secrets to the grave. His subordinates fared even better. Masaji Kitano, who ran Unit 731 after Ishii, became the director of Green Cross Corporation, one of Japan's largest pharmaceutical companies. He oversaw the production of blood products and vaccines, the same man who once drained prisoners of their blood to see how long they could survive. He died in 1986, wealthy and respected. Ryoichi Naito, another senior Unit 731 scientist, founded his own pharmaceutical company and became one of Japan's most successful businessmen. He was celebrated as an innovator in the medical field. He died in 1982, honored and mourned. Hideo Futagi, who conducted vivisections and frostbite experiments, became a professor at Kyoto University and later served as the president of the Japan Meteorological Society. He was regarded as a leading expert in environmental medicine. He died in 1993, having never faced any consequences for his actions. These men didn't hide. They didn't live in shame. They thrived. They were reintegrated into society with the full support of the Japanese government and the tacit approval of the American occupation authorities. And the reason is simple. They had information that the Americans wanted, and justice was less important than strategic advantage. The data itself, the fruits of all those experiments, was used extensively by the U.S. biological warfare program. Fort Detrick, the U.S. Army's primary bioweapons research facility, received and analyzed the Unit 731 reports. American scientists studied the plague dissemination methods. They reviewed the frostbite data. They examined the pathology reports from vivisection experiments, and they applied these findings to their own research. The knowledge gained from the torture and murder of thousands of innocent people became part of America's military arsenal. In the decades that followed, the U.S. biological weapons program expanded dramatically. The Americans developed their own strains of anthrax, botulism, and tularemia. They tested these agents on animals, but the baseline data, the understanding of how these diseases progressed in human beings, came directly from Unit 731. The Americans never acknowledged this publicly. The documents remained classified for decades, but the connection is undeniable. The American bioweapons program was built, in part, on the foundation of Japanese war crimes. For more than 30 years, the story of Unit 731 was effectively erased from history. It wasn't taught in Japanese schools. It wasn't mentioned in American textbooks. Survivors and witnesses were silenced, either through intimidation or indifference. The few who spoke out were dismissed or ignored, and the men responsible lived out their lives in comfort, their crimes buried under layers of bureaucracy and classified documents. But history has a way of resurfacing. In the 1980s, investigative journalists in Japan began digging into wartime atrocities, and the name Unit 731 started appearing in print. Survivors came forward with their stories. Chinese and Korean victims' families demanded recognition and reparations, and slowly, painfully, the truth began to emerge. The Japanese government's response was evasive. Officials acknowledged that Unit 731 existed and that regrettable activities may have occurred, but they refused to provide details or accept full responsibility. They claimed that most of the records had been destroyed and that it was impossible to verify the extent of the atrocities. This was, of course, a lie. The records existed. The Americans had them. But the Japanese government, unwilling to confront the full horror of its wartime conduct, chose deflection over accountability. The American response was even more cynical. When journalists and researchers began requesting access to the Unit 731 documents under the Freedom of Information Act, the U.S. government stonewalled. They released heavily redacted files, withheld key documents, and claimed that full disclosure would harm national security. The message was clear. The data was still valuable, and the deal made in 1946 was still in effect. Justice, even decades later, was still less important than secrecy. In 2006, a Japanese court rejected a lawsuit filed by Chinese victims of Unit 731, ruling that too much time had passed, and that the government had no legal obligation to compensate the victims. The survivors, many of them elderly and impoverished, were left with nothing. No apology, no recognition, no justice. And in the United States, the role of American authorities in protecting Unit 731's leadership remains a footnote in history, barely mentioned in official accounts of the post-war period. The narrative presented to the American public is one of moral clarity. The United States defeated fascism, held war criminals accountable, and rebuilt Japan as a democracy. The fact that this narrative is incomplete, that it omits one of the most shameful deals in American diplomatic history, is rarely acknowledged. It's easy to talk about Unit 731 in terms of data, strategy, and geopolitics. It's easy to discuss the implications for the Cold War, the biological weapons race, the failures of justice. But we can't lose sight of the human cost. The individuals who suffered and died in those laboratories weren't abstractions. They were people. They had names, families, lives that were stolen from them. Imagine being taken from your home in the middle of the night. You don't know why. You haven't done anything wrong. You're transported to a facility in the middle of nowhere, thrown into a cell and told nothing. Days pass, weeks. You hear screams from other cells, but you never see the people making them. And then One day, the door opens. You're dragged to a room, strapped to a table, and you realize in those final moments that you're not going to leave. That whatever's about to happen, there's no escape, no mercy, no hope. That was the reality for thousands of people. Children who were infected with diseases they couldn't understand, women who were vivisected while pregnant, their unborn children examined like specimens, men who were frozen, thawed, and frozen again until their limbs rotted away. And every single one of them died in agony, their suffering meticulously documented by men in white coats who saw them not as human beings, but as data points. And when it was over, when the war ended and the world moved on, there was no reckoning. The perpetrators walked free, the victims were forgotten, and the institutions responsible, both Japanese and American, buried the story as deep as they could. There's a question that haunts this story, and it's one we need to confront. How does this happen? How do doctors, scientists, educated men who took oaths to do no harm become willing participants in industrial-scale torture and murder? And how do institutions, democracies that claim to value justice and human rights, decide that protecting these men is more important than holding them accountable? The answer is uncomfortable. It happens because we allow it, because we prioritize expedience over ethics, because we tell ourselves that the ends justify the means, that strategic advantage is worth the moral cost, that some crimes are too useful to punish. The Americans who made the deal with Shiro Ishii weren't monsters. They were government officials, military officers, intelligence analysts, people who thought they were doing the right thing, or at least the necessary thing, in the context of the emerging Cold War. They looked at the data Unit 731 had produced and saw an opportunity. They weighed the value of that information against the principle of justice, and they chose information. They rationalized it. They classified it. They moved on. And because they made that choice, the men responsible for some of the worst atrocities in human history were never held accountable. They lived comfortable lives. They raised families. They were respected members of their communities. And the message sent to the world was clear. If you have something valuable enough, if you can offer the right information to the right people, your crimes can be forgiven. Not publicly, not officially, but in the ways that matter. In the quiet corridors of power where deals are made and history is written, you can be forgiven. This isn't ancient history. The structures that allowed this to happen, the institutions that prioritize secrecy and strategic advantage over accountability, still exist. The logic that justified protecting Unit 731's leadership, the cold calculation that some knowledge is worth any price, is still embedded in the way powerful nations operate. We see it in the suppression of evidence. We see it in the classification of documents that should be public. We see it in the refusal to confront uncomfortable truths about our own history. And we see it in the silence. Because even now, decades after the last perpetrator died, the story of Unit 731 is not widely known. It's not taught in schools. It's not part of the cultural memory in the way that the Holocaust is, or Hiroshima, or the other defining atrocities of the 20th century. It's a footnote in the history of World War II, a footnote in the history of biological warfare, a footnote in the history of American-Japanese relations. And that silence is not accidental. It's a choice made over and over again by governments, by institutions, by societies that find it easier to forget than to confront. The story of Unit 731 is not a story about the past. It's a story about what we're willing to accept, about the bargains we make when we think no one is watching, about the way power and knowledge can corrode moral boundaries until there's nothing left but raw utility. Shiro Ishii believed that science had no allegiance to ethics, only to results. The American officials who granted him immunity believed that national security justified any compromise. And the world, largely, believed that it was easier to move on than to confront the full horror of what had been done and what had been forgiven. But the victims of Unit 731 never moved on. They died in agony, their suffering used to generate data that would benefit the very nations that refused to acknowledge them. Their families never received justice, never received recognition, never received even the barest admission of wrongdoing. They were sacrificed on the altar of geopolitical expediency, and their sacrifice was buried under decades of classified documents and institutional denial. We tell ourselves that we've learned from history, that the atrocities of the past have taught us the value of human rights, the importance of accountability, the necessity of transparency. But the story of Unit 731 suggests otherwise. It suggests that when the stakes are high enough, when the rewards are valuable enough, we're still willing to make the same compromises, still willing to protect the guilty if they have something we want, still willing to forget the victims if remembering them is inconvenient. The human experiments America paid Japan to forget are not forgotten, not entirely. They linger in the margins of history, in the classified files that remain sealed, in the testimonies of survivors that were ignored, in the comfortable graves of men who should have hanged. They linger as a reminder that justice is not inevitable, that accountability is not guaranteed, that the powerful can escape consequences if they have the right information, the right connections, the right timing. And they linger as a warning that the structures that enabled Unit 731, that protected its leadership, that buried its crimes, are still in place. That the logic that justified those decisions, the cold calculus of national interest over moral principle, is still operational. That the next time a government faces a choice between justice and advantage, between transparency and secrecy, between accountability and expedience, there's no guarantee they'll choose differently. The question is not whether we remember Unit 731. The question is whether we remember it well enough to recognize when it's happening again, whether we remember it well enough to say no, whether we remember it well enough to insist that some prices are too high, some bargains too corrupt, some silences too dangerous to accept. Because the human experiments America paid Japan to forget are not just a historical tragedy, they're a test of whether we mean what we say when we talk about human rights, about justice, about the lessons of history. And so far, we've failed that test, over and over again. In the quiet rooms where deals are made, in the archives where documents are sealed, in the textbooks where this story is omitted, we've failed. But it's not too late. It's never too late to tell the truth, to demand accountability, to refuse to let the powerful write history in their own favor, to remember the victims, not as abstractions or statistics, but as human beings who suffered and died because their lives were deemed less valuable than the data their deaths could produce. That's the lesson of Unit 731. Not that humans are capable of unimaginable cruelty, we already knew that, but that institutions, democracies, nations that claim to stand for justice are capable of enabling that cruelty, protecting it, benefiting from it, and then erasing it from memory. And that if we want to be better, if we want to actually learn from history rather than simply mythologize it, we have to confront that reality, unflinchingly, completely, without the comfort of distance or the convenience of amnesia. The experiments happened, the bargain was made, the silence was chosen, and the question now, the only question that matters, is what we do with that knowledge. Whether we let it fade back into obscurity, back into the footnotes and the classified files, or whether we hold on to it, whether we let it haunt us the way it should, whether we let it shape the way we think about power and justice and the stories we tell ourselves about who we are. Because the dead of Unit 731 are still waiting for recognition, waiting for justice, waiting for the world to admit what was done to them and what was done to protect the men who did it. And until that happens, until we stop paying for silence with our own complicity, their story isn't over. It's still happening. In every choice we make to look away, in every compromise we accept, in every bargain we make when we think no one is watching. The human experiments America paid Japan to forget are not forgotten. Not by the victims, not by history, and not by us. Not anymore.